our good friend and my good friend Rit. I first met Rit many years ago in the Bloomberg administration when I think he was working for consulting. I think it was McKinsey, right? He left, came to the city. He was, I believe, the first ever chief sustainability officer for New York City, and was one of the principal, if not the principal architect of Plan YC, which has become, not just a local but an international phenomenon with people all over the world crafting sustainability plans after Rit and Dan Doctoroff and the deputy mayor and Mayor Bloomberg put it out there. I'll never forget, I think we were trying to, when I was commissioner, we were trying to catch each other when he first got appointed. A couple of weeks went by, we couldn't connect, and I finally caught up with him at a holiday party that Dan Doctoroff was throwing, and I think we sat down, we finally met over a glass of wine, and we mapped out the taxi portion of Plan YC on a napkin, went back, worked really hard, and what he did was not just put together an astounding plan, but implemented it, and we worked together for years on doing that. And the most interesting part was when one day when the mayor was thinking about, or maybe Kevin Sheekey was thinking about running for the mayor for president at the time, which would have been great. He basically decided, we're going to speed up the 2030 timetable for hybrid cabs to like now. We all hell broke loose. I remember doing a press conference. We lost every court challenge for the most part, back and forth, up to the Supreme Court of the United States, which declined to hear the case. But in the interim, because of the gas prices being so high, half the fleet became hybrid electric, and now, and that's really thanks to Rit and his good work. And now he, after serving at Columbia and having a couple of other gigs, is now doing something very interesting, which we're all looking to learn more about, which is working for Google Sidewalk Labs with his whole friend Dan, working together on some innovative, interesting projects. But a lot of our members of the audience wanted to hear from you. What exactly is Sidewalk Labs? What's it doing? What's it planning to do? Is it monetizing things, helping the public? All that stuff we're very excited to hear about, and we're very glad that you're back in New York and that you've joined us. So without further ado, Rit Agarwal, let's give him a big hand of applause. Chief Policy Officer for Sidewalk Labs.
All right, thank you, Matt, and I will try to tell as much as I can. We like to preserve a certain aura of mystery around Sidewalk Labs because, hey, it's just more fun that way. But I'm happy to talk about what we're doing because I'm very excited about it. And I also want to share, for an audience that I know is quite savvy about technology, but really cares about cities and cares about mobility. I wanted to offer some of my personal perspectives because I'm kind of a fish out of water at a place like Sidewalk Labs. Sidewalk Labs was started a little over a year and a half ago through a partnership between the leadership of Google, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and Dan Doctoroff, who, as Matt said, was my boss, in fact, I think yours as well, at City Hall as deputy mayor. Went on to be the CEO of Bloomberg LP and is now the CEO of Sidewalk Labs. And the original idea behind it is that we believe that urban technology has huge promise, but to date, in many cases, has been beset with an inability really to incorporate a deep understanding of how cities work into technological products. We all know this. We know that Silicon Valley prizes disruption, sometimes for its own sake. We know that it tends to originate its product ideas from a relatively narrow demographic that isn't necessarily representative of all the people who live in cities. And the things that many people in Silicon Valley optimize for are not necessarily the only values and objectives of cities. And so Sidewalk Labs was formed with the idea that we need to bring together the deep, profound, transformative potential of technology with the understanding of cities that we like to think of as urbanism. And so really Sidewalk Labs exists to bridge that gap between the technologist and the urbanist and bring those two areas of expertise together to develop products. We're organized as an incubator, basically. We exist to identify broad areas of opportunity and either to start companies to realize those opportunities or to create them through acquisitions, investments, etc. Our first company that many of you may know of is Intersection. We created Intersection through a private equity arrangement. And Intersection is primarily known for the Link NYC system. It's the leading partner in the joint venture that's doing the Link NYC, a series of kiosks that turn the former payphone network around New York City. We're laying a whole new network of high capacity fiber around the city and giving the people of New York free Wi-Fi basically on every commercial block in the city, all 5 boroughs when it is eventually rolled out over the next 3 or 4 years, paid for by advertising revenue and providing a free service, and also, by the way, providing a very significant revenue share to the city of New York. The second thing that we've started is a company called Flow. Flow is a firm that we are building from scratch. Its fundamental insight is that data has the potential to transform urban mobility, even in ways that it has not yet done. Of course, we've got Andre from VIA, we've got lots of examples. I know much of the discussion already was around Uber. Somehow you can't have a conversation about cities and technology without talking about Uber. I'll lift one of their images in a moment. But we think that's just scratching the surface, because we think, and so much of what you and the students who have been presenting are working on, is how you use better information fundamentally to transform even not just how we manage, not just how we dispatch, but actually how we conceptualize mobility in our cities. And we're not limited to mobility. We are in the process of beginning our thinking on areas ranging from how structures are built, to how we use public spaces, to how we provide social services, with, again, that idea that a deep understanding of how cities actually work can inform new kinds of products that have not come to the market yet. And so what I wanted to offer to you is my perspective as somebody who comes out of a non-technology background on 3 areas that I think the digital revolution is going to require new approaches to urban design, particularly in the realm of mobility. And, you know, Matt gave me a very complimentary introduction, but my background does not say technology. I actually have a PhD in history. Not a lot of people focus on the future with a PhD in American history. I can tell you lots and lots about late 18th and early 19th century New York. In some ways, I think that helped prepare me for thinking about the future of the city as I did in Plan YC. I was a management consultant. I've been a professor. I still am a professor. I've been a consultant to city governments, and of course, as Matt pointed out, I spent my time in City Hall. Not necessarily what the technologists in the world think of as the most innovative set of experiences to bring to the table. Mentioning, oh, hey, you know, in 1912 we did things this way, isn't really the way it works in Silicon Valley. But happily at Sidewalk Labs, we're trying to bring that kind of perspective to bear on what technology can do for the city. And so, I get to be the voice of the urbanist when new ideas come up and are generated by either technologists who are within Sidewalk Labs or as we're developing our perspective on changes in the industry. And so it often happens, as it did 2 weeks ago, that I'm presented with an idea or an image that comes from outside that looks like this: the future. And many of you have seen, no doubt, Uber's policy paper on flying cars and how that's going to be the future of urban transportation. And so Dan Doctoroff and my colleagues come to me and they say, Rit, with all of your deep understanding of how cities work and all the puts and takes and stakeholders and a long trajectory of history, what's your profound thought on this concept? And usually it's something like this. Like, really? Because, of course, having that kind of historical perspective can sometimes be a burden. It can sometimes limit your thinking, even as it allows you to make really interesting connections. Because the scholarly historian in me looks at this and harkens back to another image that some of you will recognize from urban history, which is that one. Those of you over 40 in the room will recognize this as being from the Jetsons, right? And so we see actually the very same ideas over and over again. And so I find myself often being put in the position of the curmudgeon, looking at images like this and in fact, imagining images like that. And I think it's a risk. And it's something that has begun to teach me a great deal about how we, as people who care about cities, have to think about technology. Because there is no question, I believe, that we are in the early days of the fourth revolution in urban technology. The historian that I am knows that cities have gone through a profound set of changes at several points in the last 2 centuries. The first was the advent of the steam engine, right, which transformed cities from small places that we would barely count as a city today into modern metropolises with factory employment and supplied by railroads from long distances and housing millions of people. You couldn't really have that except in a very few places around the world before the advent of the steam engine. The advent of electricity, of course, converted our cities into 24/7 hives of activity with elevators and lighting and radio and streetcars and all the things that accelerated the pace of urban life into the 20th century. And then, of course, the automobile, which, as you all know, being transportation experts, transformed the city profoundly in ways that sometimes were very good and in many cases wound up being very bad. And I would argue that the digital transformation really is just beginning. We look around, we see the changes that we feel in Google Maps and Uber and Via and all sorts of new services, and yet the city has not yet been profoundly changed in anywhere near the way that electricity or the steam engine or the automobile did. And so as people who understand cities, we need to recognize, we need to prepare for, in fact, we need to plan and I hope shape the way that digital technology will almost certainly have that same level of deep impact on our cities. It comes from a variety of digital innovations. It's from smartphones and constant connectivity, from crowdsourced data, from sensors, from self-driving cars, from robots, from drones, all of these things. And we've seen these early applications, whether it is on-demand businesses that use location data and a pool of part-time workers, sharing economy that uses crowdsourced supply, surveillance and data analysis. They range from generally warm and positive things, such as what Pittsburgh is doing with traffic signals and AI, to the drones that the Baltimore Police Department is using to surveil the city, which, depending on how you feel and depending on how it's used, could be both good and bad. And so what I'd like to do is share with you my thinking, and this is in no way prescriptive, none of us can truly see the future, but ways that I think digital technology is going to require a response from the world of people who do policy and planning in cities around mobility. So these are my 3 suggestions. The first one is non-controversial. The self-driving car. You've talked about it several times today. There is no way this is not going to be a fundamental agent of transformation in the city. Got over here, 1909, the Ford Model T first driven across the United States to demonstrate how robust it was, and of course Elon Musk has promised us that in 2017 his Tesla will do exactly the same thing. And as we all know, there are huge benefits to the self-driving car. Benefits to highway safety from the elimination of distracted driving, the fact that depending on how it's programmed, self-driving cars will respond rationally to route congestion and to tolls, the potential to eliminate the need for on-site parking. All of these, I think, make this a very good thing. But of course, the self-driving car raises very serious questions for cities as well. In theory, the self-driving car can be programmed always to obey the law, something that sadly we cannot count on from the average human driver, especially not in Manhattan. But will it be? And by whom? And how will that be verified? And who will be penalized if it doesn't? Are all questions that we don't have an answer for. The US DOT, I think, has done a really good job thus far of laying the groundwork for how safety will be evaluated in the self-driving car. But most of its focus has been on the prevention of vehicle-to-vehicle collisions. And exactly how it will be valued and how it will be considered when it comes to vehicle-to-pedestrian and vehicle-to-cycle collisions is I think, still unknown. And in fact, just as the automobile did, we may have to think about how to train ourselves as urbanites to interact differently with vehicles, to signal, to let them know that we're taking the right of way or whatever it is. And that may be a fruitful area that policymakers and innovators like yourselves need to focus on. Even more important, of course, is the question of how the self-driving car gets used. It's widely understood that the key difference is going to be, is it privately owned or is it shared? And this, of course, has huge implications. Tesla itself recently released a video in which it imagined a world of private AV ownership, in which parking challenges were solved by sending the car home after you got out of it, right? That's great for the owner. That's terrible for the city, because it basically doubles your VMT, of course. And it raises the real threat that today, as we're all focused on reducing vehicle miles traveled, and we know that we're stuck still at this general number of 1.2 occupants per vehicle, that is achieved only because right now the minimum is 1.0. And when that floor drops to 0 occupants per vehicle as the minimum, we really have to think of a much higher burden in terms of managing that up rather than down. It's entirely possible, and I hope it's true, that the economics of sharing will be so attractive that people don't need to own their cars, and in fact, they won't want to. But it's not clear that that will be the case, and there may be a fruitful area for research, for technology, and for policy innovation around that important question. Second thing, I think, is what coordinates land use and travel patterns. Because as we know, transportation management is fundamentally about coordinating the demand for movement. We aggregate people and vehicles. We get vehicles onto arterials and highways to make things more efficient. We get people onto buses and subways and taxis in order to make transportation more efficient. And since the advent of the railroad, and even before, we've used infrastructure, we've used the supply of transportation to shape demand. This creates a hierarchy. Some trips are easier than others. A location near a subway stop like this one is clearly more accessible than one that's a mile away from a subway stop. You go out into the exurbs and you know that a location near a highway interchange is more valuable than a location that requires a several mile access road onto an interstate highway. And it's even true about things that aren't truly fixed. It's even true about the services that are layered on top of the physical infrastructure. A bus route is a locationally fixed supply of transportation. Because the whole point of the bus route and the bus stop sign is to tell people, gather here so you can all go together in this direction. It's a coordination mechanism. And so what happens is that the smartphone and location data and on-demand services eliminate that. What Uber and Bridge, Via, and others have demonstrated is that digital technology can identify, aggregate, and service demand. And this inverts the relationship between the supply of transportation and the demand for transportation. Instead of people adjusting their travel patterns to match the supply reconfigures to fit the demand. This helps eliminate the hierarchy of trips. All trips can be one-seat rides. All trips can be point-to-point. On the one hand, it's great news. It has the potential dramatically to improve the experience of taking transit. And this, in turn, can help reduce the challenge of scarce urban housing by making lots of areas that are traditionally unattractive because they're difficult to access more attractive because now they're easier to access. On the other hand, it eliminates transportation supply as a tool to shape development. What does transit-oriented development mean if you summon the transit network to you rather than the other way around? And what I think this means is that influencing the dispatching and routing of this flexible transportation supply becomes ever more important to shaping how our cities are arranged. And the question of routing, dispatching, pricing becomes ever more important, and in fact will eventually be the only real tool we have to shape our cities. The third change that I think we will have to wrestle with is that the curb will become the best managed part of the city. Today, not so much. I hope you've all read Tepper Isn't Going Out, and if you haven't, you need to, because you don't understand really the dynamics of curbside management until you've read Tepper. But the pressures on the curb are increasing dramatically, as we know. In the past, it was totally fine. You rent out the curb in hour or day-long chunks because the primary demand on it is for people who need to leave their vehicle while they do something. They go for a shopping trip, they attend a meeting, they go to work for the entire day. You're basically selling curbside space on an hourly basis. You can manage that in the old way. You can manage that with a parking meter. You can manage that with a meter made with chalk on a stick. It's better today to manage that with a muni meter or pay by phone. But those are things that lend themselves to hour-long increments because they can be enforced once an hour, and you can have a reasonable amount of enforcement. That's not the demand on the curb that we are seeing today, and certainly not in the future. As shopping trips convert to deliveries, as deliveries convert from large boxes to single items that come whenever you want them, we're going to see, as we have seen, an exponential increase in the number of small trips that require not an hour to make a delivery, but a couple of minutes. And of course, as those become robotic, as those become autonomous vehicles, whatever it is, they'll be able to plan when they will be where in much more precise ways. So today, if I offered you the ability to rent a parking space from 4:06 to 4:10, it would really be useless to you because you can't figure out if you're going to be there that precisely. You might miss your whole window. But that's not going to be the case as our systems get more and more precise. Further, as we shift from parking and leaving your car to shared rides, we see more and more, in fact, what we've already seen over the last couple of years, is that drop-off and pickup on the curb becomes ever more important and ever more contested. And the demand becomes even more important when you think about it in terms of how you optimize the system. Because just as 10 or 15 years ago it was the case that low-cost airlines would only fly into underutilized airports, not because they were necessarily cheaper, but because they knew they wouldn't have delays. And if you're trying to optimize the usage of your vehicles, you cannot afford delays in unloading and loading. Right? And so that's where Southwest and JetBlue and the others gravitated towards those those excess capacity airports. We're going to see the same challenges because delivery services and on-demand travel services that can plan in that minute a way and that really need that third ride in the vehicle to make the economics work. They can't afford to be stuck for 3 minutes or 5 minutes waiting for their place to drop off or pick up a passenger. They're going to be willing perhaps to pay a premium for that, but it's going to be important for the overall optimization of the system. And so the demand for that kind of management of selling the curbside in minute increments with the ability to reserve space is going to be really important. And you cannot do that. We do not currently have the tools to sell the curbside access in that precise way today. So we're going to need it. We're going to need it, and of course the digital technology allows it, whether it's through robotic enforcement, whether it's through cameras or sensors or payment vehicles or what have you. The potential is there, and I think it's an area that I hope people like you identify both the policy and the technology solutions to, and companies like Sidewalk Labs will find it very exciting to make use of that. And so these are the three things that I thought I would bring to your attention today. The usage patterns of the self-driving car, the replacement of supply with information and demand as the shaper of transportation patterns, and the dynamic curve. Because I want to emphasize more and more, and I don't think I have to stress this too much with a group like this, because you all get it. Technology in the city, it's not about flying cars and robots. It's not really about the vehicles or the gadgets themselves. The lesson of history is not about the technology. The light bulb did not transform the city. The steam engine did not transform the city. The steam railroad transformed the city. The steam-driven factory transformed the city. The elevator transformed the city. It is the applications of these gadgets. It is the way that they are used, the ownership patterns, the institutional frameworks, and the regulatory systems around them that have shaped how technology changes the way we live in cities. And that will be no different over the next 50 years as we see this next digital or this next technological revolution. So this brings me back to the flying cars, because it's not the widgets and it's not the gizmos. But after I thought how silly this might be and how easy it is to mock the fact that Uber is promoting an image that you could have lifted out of the Jetsons 40 some odd years ago, there is a very big difference in these two images. Because one envisioned a world of private ownership of flying cars, and one envisioned a world of flying cars that are shared, that are on demand, that are not privately owned and are therefore much better utilized. I don't know anything about the reality of flying cars, how safe they would be, what their economics would be. But I do know this. I don't believe that we'll ever see a world when people own lots and lots of their own flying cars. This, I think the jury's still out. And this is why we, as people who understand cities, people who believe in the value of cities, people who understand transportation systems, have to take this digital revolution seriously. Because there is reality there, even if we don't believe it's all baked. And whether we engage with that fully is going to shape whether the technology revolution happens to us or whether we shape it and are part of it. Thank you.
Do you have any questions for Rit? Okay, can we get to the microphone or someone? Could we have an on-demand microphone? Is that a possibility? A flying microphone, maybe?
Open microphone.
Yes, Rit. I'm Robert DiDomenico, cargo fish, de facto teleportation utility.
Okay.
Not as out there as that, but I heard you speak about the growth in deliveries. And could you speak a little to the effectiveness of the current 99% of deliveries in the city, which happen through the municipal water system? We use 835 pounds of water a day, and we eat 5 pounds of food. So perhaps there's a better way to deliver that you just haven't heard of yet.
Okay. So pipelines, sure. We don't know quite what to say about that.
No, just stop out.
Oh, okay. Happy to take a look. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes?
When you look at that picture on the left from Uber, and you realize that the cars are not going to stay there, someone else is going to use them, and they're not going back to home, do you see that as a potential for adaptive reuse for housing?
In terms of the parking lot itself.
The parking lot, the parking garage, the multi-family structure, the multi-story structure.
No, I think there's no question, and this is hardly an original idea on my part, that parking garages. So we have had a number of conversations with some of the companies who own parking garages around the country, and not one of them is buying new garages. Right? And so the idea that that is a growing industry, of course, nobody believes. The idea that it is a real estate play for future reuse, everyone seems to think. The question, to a certain extent, I think on that is, how much curbside space do we actually need? So if that volume, you could imagine a parking garage turning into a delivery hub, right? Or a transit center, right? If you actually need 200 pickup spots, right? That might look very much like an airport, right? You've got lots of airports where you have lots of curbs in front of a terminal because you actually need 3 or 4 curb lengths, right? So the demand for the curb is several times the width of the terminal, and so just one curb doesn't do it. You could imagine something like that being the future for a lot of parking garages. Less so in a place like Manhattan, but in mid-sized cities, certainly.
Okay. Rit, thank you. A big round of applause for Rit. Thanks for taking the time. I think we now all know what Sidewalk Labs does, and we're very optimistic about it. Thank you.